I'm your host, Jack McLean, and tonight we have Aaron Kellet as our guest, the physical performance coach of the Australian men's cricket team. Aaron has spent almost 20 years of experience in elite sport, bringing a background in strength and conditioning and sports science, and has been in leadership positions in Tennis Australia and Western Bulldogs in the Australian Rules Football League. Before we start tonight's episode, our mission here at Prepare Like a Pro is to empower aspiring athletes and staff with practical knowledge from some of the industry's most inspiring individuals and to strengthen the AFL community. If you like the show, please show your support by following us on Instagram and subscribing to the podcast. We're on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. Thanks for jumping on, Aaron.
Pleasure, Jack. Thanks for inviting me, mate. It's a real honour.
Looking forward to our chat, mate. Let's dive right at the beginning of your career. At what age did you discover you had a passion for strength and conditioning?
Yeah, look, that's a while ago now, isn't it? I think if I was to look back on sort of where it all started, I was back in 1994, which is a long time ago. I was a member of the Victorian Institute of Sport cricket squad, and still sort of aspiring to wear the baggy green myself. And as part of that scholarship program, it was my last year of high school. I'd have to travel in 3 times a week into RMIT, where I do my weights program, and it was my first exposure to what is classically known as strength and conditioning. And a guy named Vern McMillan was the strength and conditioning coach for the Victorian Institute of Sport then. And I'd go in there as a sort of 17-year-old, and I'd be training at 6:30 in the morning, and members of the awesome foursome would be power cleaning weights, and other really elite athletes would be walking around the old RMIT gym in the city. And I was amazed and blown away by what people could do. And so for me, I was just really inspired. Okay, that was a way that I could improve myself. And so experiencing that approach and really getting into my own physical preparation, showed me that there was a sort of an industry or a profession sitting behind that. So when I went through that sort of career development process, because I was in my final year of high school at the time and looking to figure out what I was going to do at uni, that was one of the platforms. I was really into biology, I was really into chemistry, and I was really into physical education. So yeah, that was the sort of path I took, with going into a Bachelor of Applied Science in what started as physical education, then into human movement. So that was probably the first foray into realizing that there was a job and a profession out there that involved training people and training athletes to be elite performers.
Yeah, awesome. And it's so important to see it, isn't it, and feel it and be in that environment. For the young coaches listening in that don't have that ability right now to be in that environment, but they feel like they're studying and they feel like that there is a passion there. What would your recommendation be for being in that position if you're not lucky enough to be a talented athlete, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, one of the huge advantages and the big shifts today is that, I just described that was my first exposure. I didn't know there was anything like this out there, right? And that's because the accessibility of information, it was just not the same, Whereas now, I think, the ability to understand and to gather information and get insights into what it takes to be a top practitioner, a top performer is really easy to get hold of. So for young coaches, I think it's very easy to get the information. It's really easy to understand the X's and O's of what we do. The best piece of advice, and I've listened to some of your podcasts previously. I think it's a really consistent theme from some of us old cronies, right? It's just you've got to get in the trenches and coach, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be, a strength and conditioning coach. Some of the most impactful stuff for me early on was when I was coaching young cricketers in a private academy, teaching them on a Friday night how to hit cover drives and land the ball on a cut surface, right? So, I think you got to get in the trenches as young coaches and learn how to organize human traffic and manage attention and communicate with people and elicit behavioral change.
And early on in your career, like as you mentioned, Vern McMillan, who were some other strong influences that helped you along your way?
Yeah, the first person who gave me a shot was David Butterfin. I was in my final year of my undergrad degree, and David Butterfin was at the North Melbourne Football Club at the time, and through some personal connections through through my cricket. And, he gave me a bit of a shot, and it was a volunteer. It was doing all of the sort of bits and pieces work at the North Melbourne Footy Club, trying to essentially help David's job to be a little bit easier. The resources at an AFL club in the late 90s were not the same as they are now. So I was really lucky to A, get an opportunity, and B, because there wasn't, every man and his dog there, I was able to, get a feel for all parts of the program. So he was a big influence in my sort of stepping into this profession, and certainly being able to get exposure to, the elite performance.
You mentioned something that I noted down. Your intention was to assist his role because of the resources were limited, and you were doing a little bit of everything. And so, same for the coaches that are listening. Obviously, it is challenging and it's competitive, and you've got to be thinking about where you're going and your career, of course. But how important is it to have that selfless mindset and be there to assist those that are in those leadership positions, I guess?
I think there's two layers to it, right? Like one is the recognition that actually the job that we do as coaches is to serve others, right? Is to elevate others into being the best version they can be, to get achieve their dreams, to avoid the, apologies for the cliche. So that's the first and foremost, is being in a service mindset is really important, to succeed. And secondly, it's really difficult to, forecast where you're going to be at any given time in your career. So what I've learned over time is that the best way to progress in your career is just do a great job in the one you're in right now. So if you're a sports science assistant, and your job is to take USGs and, put GPS units on players and make sure they come back, and, some of the real menial tasks, just do a great job, and that'll be recognized, because, those are the things that actually make an impact. It's just making everyone's life easy, making sure that things are delivered really well, and that ultimately that we're helping the people around us be able to do what they do.
And you're forming good habits, aren't you? Just like an athlete. Like if you're treating those potentially smaller things that maybe are quite easy for someone else to do, and they don't feel special or sexy, but if you're treating them with the respect of the big things and the things that you're trying to strive towards and to be able to make an impact with. But if you look after those little things, it's going to put you in good stead later on when you're in a position to make a big impact. Would you?
Yeah, well said.
Yeah,
well said.
And going on with influencers and mentors, who are some other guys that help you along the way in the early days?
So early on, it was all about trying to be the best sort of technician and practitioner I could be. So a lot of the sort of people that I was able to work with, so early on, I moved up to Brisbane to work at Cricket Australia after my AFL days, and I was able to get some exposure to the Queensland Academy of Sport, and work with people like Kieran Young and Suki Hobson and Michael Davey. These are high level practitioners, really, really amazing at what they do, working across multiple sports. So certainly from a technical perspective, some of those influences from, Julian Jones at the AEST, Dan Baker, these guys that have been in the game for long periods of time at the elite level, they were massive influences on my sort of technical development. And then as I sort of progressed through my career, then the coaching stuff becomes really, really interesting and integral.
Yep.
And so that's where the head coaches have been the biggest influence on me, because as a performance coach, with the head coach is essentially the wind in your sail, right? So your ability to sort of work closely with the head coach it is crucial. So in my time at tennis, people like Simon Ray, Bernard Gerlitz, Brent Larkham, these people, amazing coaches, Ben Mathias, Josh Eagle, Pat Rafter, these are, amazing at what they do. And then, in cricket, Darren Lehman, and more recently, Justin Langer, like these people are elite at, managing programs and eliciting behavioral change in athletes.
You mentioned, the developing the technical side. While a coach is going through that phase where they're developing their philosophy and you're refining things and you're developing your technical side and like you mentioned, your coaching. When you see something that's done really, really well and you want to, bring that into your practice, how quick would you do it? Is it first trying it on yourself? Is it first just sitting with it? And is it a slow burn? Or do you think once you've made your mind up and you're like, no, I've seen that, I'm just going to transfer it straight over? Or is it an off-season review and, you'll implement it into pre-season? Like, take us through how you'll implement new methods, I guess, and philosophies.
Yeah, I think it's all of the above, right? Like I think, certainly personal experience is an important part of any sort of research of a method, right? Understanding the experience that that a method or a principle entails is really important.
Yep.
Being able to walk the talk a little bit, but certainly making sure that you understand, what is the evidence behind this? What is the science? What's the research telling you if there's any there? And if not, what's some of the practical real world data that exists, if any? I think those are those are all of the levels of evidence that I think you want to try and pick off before you start rolling it out to an elite athlete cohort that are really sensitive to change.
Yeah. Okay. I like that. So it's a balance between speak to other practitioners that are in a similar position to yourself, as well as being up to date with the latest research as well. What would be, if there was a percentage split, how often would it be speaking to other colleagues opposed to reading up and listening to podcasts or researching and, more of that reading books, that form of content?
I wouldn't want to put a sort of a numerical value on it, but it's I value practical real world evidence, and there's some key people that I would turn to, or some key sectors that I might look to for some of that evidence, but certainly the information is always available.
Yeah, fantastic. Going back to your career progression, so David Butterfield helped you out with an internship, sort of informal internship role, and you're getting some experience in different fields. Where did you go next in your career?
Yeah, so at that stage, I was still aspiring to represent Australia and be standing on the MCG on Boxing Day as a player, right? So I actually went over to the UK and played some cricket over there. And when I came back, the opportunities in sport were just not there. So I actually pivoted and went into general population and worked in council leisure centres and private gyms and ran a personal training business and looked after community rehab programs and worked on the gym floor and those types of things for 5 years.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's actually something that has popped up a fair bit in experienced practitioners in elite sport. There is early days, some experience in coaching on the field. And you talk about the importance of learning coaching and the art of communication from head coaches. Yeah. Running a business has a different skill set as well. And then also the one-on-one coaching. How have those sort of skill sets transferred into now you're in leadership positions? Like, has it transferred over? And if so, what sort of traits do?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, from my perspective, the themes that keep emerging are, the ability to communicate with people. So when you're working on a gym floor or working in a community rehab program or working as a personal trainer, you're interfacing with a huge diversity of people, which just expands your ability to have conversations and ask meaningful questions and understand the drivers behind behind people's behavior. Right, that's a really, really key part of coaching. The ability to manage adults in a sort of group dynamic that's a really big part of what we do, right? So to be able to do that with people of varying skill levels, varying competencies, varying capacities, those are the things that you get to experience when you're working with general population clients. And so those are invaluable for stepping into sport, where the group tends to be a little bit more homogenous, but certainly got varying degrees of capacities and capabilities just the same. So these are highly transferable skills. And then understanding, from a business perspective, you touched upon that, like understanding the commercial realities of the world is that's important. Understanding what the financial cost for a player's injury, I think, is important. It gives you perspective and understanding about where some of the drivers are from different parts of a sporting business, for example. I think those are meaningful bits of knowledge that you can gain.
So you can, like you mentioned, understand that perspective. If you can have a better ability to be able to connect with the greater sporting club, you feel, by having those experiences. Definitely,
because Australian cricket's a perfect example. These are a huge beast. You've got a variety of stakeholders. You've got huge financial interest in the game. That's a perfect example for understanding where player appearances and commercial commitments for the team. These are realities that can impact you day to day, and without sort of an understanding and a perspective about the value and where that sits and why that's important, I think it can be a real frustration. And actually, you can be if you don't do that well, you can be actually a detriment to the business.
And you mentioned that opportunities were slim at that period of time from a strength and conditioning point of view in sport, and 5 years is a good stretch. No doubt there'll be a few coaches listening with COVID. There's been some cuts in sport and that sort of thing, and they've gone into the personal training. Maybe they were doing a bit of it and sport. Now they're doing it full time. What was your mindset like at that time? Did you know you're 100% going back when the time's right? Did you think, okay, you're just parking it, or were you doing some things behind the scene to stay actively in tune with those skill sets? Take us through sort of your approach during those 5 years.
I was still doing bits and pieces, with local sporting clubs, my own cricket club at the time. We were doing some small, more program delivery stuff into some netball teams. So I still sort of was doing bits and pieces here and there, and it was really informal, and it was intermittent in nature. But certainly, looking back, I was very much, like I said before, I was very much just trying to do a good job in the one I was in, right? And so I sort of wasn't really thinking about, how will I get back into elite sport? I was enjoying what I was doing. And it just happened that a personal connection again through my own sport, knew that I was doing bits and pieces, had used me to do some bits and pieces, at Essendon Footy Club, delivering sort of a pseudo Pilates type session. He was at the Western Bulldogs, and they were looking for a weights coach, part-time weights coach, and I was able to fit it into my schedule while still doing personal training. And so that's how I sort of got back into elite sport as a part-time weights coach at the Western Bulldogs in sort of back end of 2005.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So and like you mentioned earlier in the podcast, like do a really good job of what you're currently doing and almost trust that, and it will take care of you.
It certainly served me. I've never been one to have the 5-year plan, right? So maybe it's just sort of self-serving in me, just selling the strengths of that, but it certainly served me. Like I'm just trying to do a good job in the one I'm in has generally provided opportunities.
Yeah, and something I've picked up as well, speaking to people, is the importance of, if you want a long career in sport, work in many different sports. But on that note, that what you're saying there, you sort of you took the opportunity as they presented themselves and did a really good job within them. So it wasn't the plan early days, or a mentor didn't say, Aaron, you need to work across AFL, Tennis Australia, Cricket Australia, QAS, Track and Field Olympics. That's sort of what organically happened. Is that what you're saying?
Very much so. Yeah, very much so. I had no sort of career aspiration to be, the high performance manager of an AFL club, or to be the physical performance coach of the Australian cricket team. These are amazing sort of opportunities I've been able to, be presented to me along the way. And, I like to think it's because I've done a good job, and I've been able to, positively impact the performance environments I've been in. But certainly, I've very much, taken the opportunities that have been presented that have also represented the things that I've felt important. That sort of not necessarily just sort of grabbing the first thing that presents, but certainly being aware of the things that are important and recognizing the environments that might meet those.
Yeah. So at this time you're doing some personal training, community rehab, as you mentioned. You started with a bit of Pilates at Essendon, and then you got a part-time role as a strength and power coach at Western Bulldogs. How did the progression within the Western Bulldogs role, and what did the role sort of look like?
Essentially, a guy named Justin Cordy hired me, and apologies earlier for people that I missed. I'm sure, in me reeling off names that have been influences on me, I'm sure I've missed 15 or 20 people that have been huge influences. So just shout out and apologies to those people, and hopefully you know who you are. But Justin Cordy hired me at the Western Bulldogs, and at the back end of 2005, he actually took the job to work with the Australian cricket team, and through a variety of circumstances, I ended up stepping into his shoes towards the back end of the preseason for the 2006 year. And took on the sort of physical performance manager role with the Western Bulldogs from there. So I went from part-time weights coach and hopefully doing a reasonable job and making a positive impact to being sort of given the opportunity to step into Justin's roles when he moved on to Australian cricket.
Yeah, that's huge growth in a new sport. What leadership qualities do you think they sort of to be able to have trust in yourself to be able to manage a program?
I think, I'm speculating, but I like to think that I was coaching well. I think I was delivering sort of a reasonable product into the sort of performance department. I had good relationships with people. I had managed people through my time through that 5 years I was out of sport. And I think they sort of recognised that I wasn't necessarily going to try and upset the apple cart with the plans and programs and systems that had been implemented. So I think it was maybe sort of a fortuitous event. And so looking back, I think it was probably, I think I did an okay job. We finished up pretty well that year, but I think it was probably I was not ready for that opportunity. There's some stuff I look back on and probably in hindsight now, knowing what I know now, I would have done slightly different. But yeah, what a great opportunity. I couldn't knock that back.
Yeah. And you mentioned some management experience during the 5 years. So for those that are in the private sector, what type of management work were you doing during that period? So it wasn't simply just doing a one-on-one business by the sounds of it. It was
not at all. I mean, some of the stuff I was doing, I'd taken on a role as a health and fitness manager for Maribyrnong Council. So I was managing a team of fitness staff essentially. So gym staff, personal training team, and I also had someone who was looking after sort of group fitness programs that reported to me. So I had a team of people essentially working across the health and fitness programming for a council fitness centre.
And then the next part that I wanted to open up a little bit into more detail. So now knowing what you know now, what would be some things that pop up to mind that you would do differently? Obviously, hindsight's a beautiful thing, but
I think I probably stuck a little too rigid to the original plan. I don't think I adapted fast enough to some changing sort of load circumstances that occurred. We had some ACL injuries that meant our sort of suite of players available. We had to play small. That changed our game style. So I don't think I adapted as early as I could. I kept some standalone speed and agility sessions in the program a little too deep into the preseason and early season. In hindsight, I think. I think I could have adapted and responded. And at the time, it was you're sort of delivering what you think is the best path forward for performance, and things were sort of working. It's just I think we paid the piper a little bit towards a sort of back half of the year that we needed to reverse, and thankfully we're able to do that with some assistance and some really good work collaboratively. But certainly in hindsight, there's a lot of things I think we'd all do differently in the past with certain professional experiences.
Of course, every day. And did you bring someone in to replace yourself, or what was the high performance department like around 2005, 2006?
Yeah, so the club at the end of the 2006 year, the club decided to bring in someone who would sit in above me, which at the time was a really challenging period, right? Because a young guy who's we just finished sixth, we'd beaten Collingwood in the elimination final in front of 85,000 people, and we thought we'd had a sort of really great year. It was progression on the year before. So young guy, young coach, big massive whack to the ego in many respects, right? And I don't think I necessarily responded particularly well to that. Again, all in hindsight, right? And as you sort of mature, you can recognize that there's probably some lessons that it took a little longer for me to learn. But the club made a decision to bring someone in that I would report to. And sort of that sort of was through this 2006, 2007 pre-season.
Someone that has a similar experience to that, so early success, as you mentioned, as you're maturing as a coach and a manager, what are some mature ways to respond to that when you have early success, do you think now?
I think being a little bit sort of insightful into your own strengths and weaknesses, and particularly that there's a lot to be learned from everyone around you. Those are things that I'd certainly advise. And certainly my experience was that I didn't necessarily grasp the opportunity to learn as much as I could from the people that had been brought in that the club had actually set up to help me with, right? In hindsight, there is a recognition that they'd brought some people in to actually help me, to recognize that I'd done some things really well, but I needed some support in some other areas.
Okay. Oh, that is an interesting scenario, though. So you weren't a part of creating your new team. The club brought in your assistants. Am I reading that right?
And also a direct report, right? So essentially, I was able to sort of maintain a lot of sort of the coaching and the programming side of things, but there was a sort of more of a high performance type manager step into a role above me. Yeah,
gotcha. It's interesting. And they were a qualified strength and conditioning coach, or they were a different background?
No, absolutely, yeah. The person that came in had come from another AFL club within the same the previous few years. So it was someone who'd had some success at a big club and had done a really good job, and certainly stepped in and did a great job with the Western Bulldogs. Yeah.
And then what was the next step in your career after the Doggies?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, like I said, in hindsight, I recognised that I probably didn't necessarily manage that as well as I could. But what it did do, it gave me some impetus to look for other opportunities. And that was essentially when my first exposure to working in cricket happened in 2007. And again, ironically, it was Justin Cordy again who had been working with the Australian cricket team. They'd created a role based out of Brisbane at what was the old Centre of Excellence, which is now the National Cricket Centre. And it was essentially a full-time physical performance role that was looking after all of the Cricket Australia pathway programs, including what was the old AEST cricket program, which is a sort of residential cricket academy program that ran through the winter, whilst Justin was touring with the Australian team.
Awesome. And what were you feeling there? Because that's something that you were experiencing as a 17-year-old. Now you're a practitioner on the flip side. Was it a bit of a pinch me moment that's where your career had ended up?
It was a little bit. It was. I mean, it meant that the transition was relatively smooth because I know the sport. I knew the culture of the sport, the terminology. Some of the technical models and the frameworks around that. So it was a really sort of smooth transition for me to step into that. But it was a little bit of a sort of catch me moment in the sense that I'd sort of recognized a few years prior to that my own aspirations were over, right? So to be actually up there, helping Mitchell Johnson and, these sort of young elite guys. And part of my time was also to step in and cover for Justin when he took some time off the road. And, not long after I started in Brisbane, he actually resigned to head back into AFL. So all of a sudden I found myself on the road with the Australian team with, Ricky Ponting captaining and Matthew Hayden and Adam Gilchrist. And so it was just like, it was a little bit surreal, right?
Yeah, and take us through that. So, what is what are the big differences between a high performance manager in the AFL and the performance team, and then the high performance manager in at Cricket Australia and the performance team?
Yeah, so I mean, if you want to use my current sort of position, right? So I've stepped in. I've now, this is my second innings at cricket. I started in 2016 and took on the role of physical performance coach with the team. The scope of my role is essentially to manage the physical performance program for the Australian team that's on tour at any given time, with specific reference to this Cricket Australia contracted player group. So every year, a certain number of players are centrally contracted to Cricket Australia, based on their sort of previous year's performances and likelihood to represent Australia in the coming year. So they become the primary portfolio. But cricketers are picked out of state cricket, despite contract status or otherwise. So as a squad is picked, we may have a lead-in period for that. My job is to understand we have a monitoring group of players that are likely to be picked, and we liaise and work closely with the Australian team selectors on who's in that sort of monitoring group, and we're sort of leading and guiding and influencing their preparation leading into a series. Yeah, so hopefully that gives you sort of an insight. And then we have in the past, we would have a physical performance manager, Andrew Weller, who's actually stepped into a sort of a slightly expanded role with a few bigger reports across both sports science and medicine. But he's essentially sits across Australian cricket systems, manages our sort of national standards program, testing across the country, communicating, database stuff, managing sort of national GPS integration, that type of stuff. So we've got a sort of the direct coaching line, and then we have a system guide and influence and lead capacity to our role.
And you mentioned collaboration off air and how critical that is with like the core group. How often would you be in communication with strength and conditioning coaches managing the state sides?
Yeah, I'm in communication with those guys weekly.
Right.
And at different sometimes it's multiple times a week. And for some guys, if we don't have any players coming out of one of the states, for example, then it may be a couple of weeks until I speak to them. But generally, it's on average, I'm speaking to those guys weekly, understanding player status. Thankfully we've got a centralized programming and load monitoring database that I can that's sort of open source for us to all be sort of singing from the same hymn book, so to speak. So I've got oversight on what's going on. I'm able to sort of make changes and edits and communicate based on that. But yeah, we're sort of tracking player status and trying to guide decision making from week to week. Yeah.
The contracted players given like their own sort of software and tech for then the state strength and conditioning coaches to upload that data so you have access to it all, or do those state teams all have the same sort of technology that those 17 are using?
Yeah, essentially Australian cricket invested many years ago, and actually, in my sort of initial foray in Australian cricket back in 2007 was this way. We have an athlete management system that sits across all of Australian cricket. So essentially all of the state high performance departments have access to the same database. Every player has a unique ID, and based on sort of role security, we can all get access to the same information if we've got essentially a shared accountability on a player's development.
You've worked across world-class athletes and Australian rules footballers at the top level. Are there a common sort of trend, either mindset or physical capacity, that you can recognise in young youth that they've got a bright future ahead of themselves?
Yeah, so there's two parts to the question. I'll give you two parts of the answer. One you mentioned was mindset. The thing that probably stands out from a mindset perspective with all of the greats across all of the sports that I've worked in is that I have a really clear understanding and idea about what it is they're doing and why they're doing it, particularly when it comes to core business around their skills, right? So they're this sort of notion of mindful practice is probably one of the things that stands out for me. they're very clear. They're very clear on what they're doing in a session. They're very clear on what they're working on, and they're very clear on what success looks like at any given moment for themselves.
And that's
probably the
something
first thing.
Is that something that's developed within your environment with the practitioners that you work on that intentionally, or do you think that that's a talent that those successful players sort of come in with and they've already got that sort of clarity and purpose?
I think it's both. I think that the greats, the true elite, those are attributes that they bring. There's no doubt about that. But certainly, the standards and the environment that you create as a program can help raise that within everyone that's exposed to it. I don't think that our environment of the Australian cricket changes the way that Steve Smith goes about business. I think that's something he's brought to the table. The environment has helped him in other ways and in other areas, but when it comes to the clarity of mindset around his preparation, that's something he's brought to the table. But I think he's a unique individual, and we see unique individuals across elite sport. But certainly the standards and the environment that you create can certainly raise that across the entire team, the entire squad, or the entire system.
How different or how much variability would there be in preparation to a game from a mental and physical point of view within your core group?
Yeah, there's high variation. Everyone. I mean, certainly at our level now, it's really, really important that we understand that people are coming to the table with a very, very well developed skill set and a very well developed set of attributes. So a lot of it is about making sure that we're creating an environment that's going to allow them to deliver on what they do best. I think I've spoken publicly about this. Sometimes the best thing you do is actually do nothing. Right? That's a skill in and of itself, is actually stay out of people's way at certain times. And then, then it's also about when you might intervene or when you may ask a meaningful question to try and, redirect. Those are sort of some of the nuanced things. But certainly in relation to your question, there's high variation based on individual needs and individual preferences for preparation. And then certainly from a physical perspective, you've got different skill sets. You've got, for us, you've got batters, bowlers, you've got spinners, wicket keepers. So there's high variation in their preparation. But even within the same skill subgroup, different players will tend to want more volume. Others will want less. Others will want certain exposures to certain drills. Others will want a different one. So there's high variation at the top end.
In terms of sports science and load management, what are some key pillars when it comes to managing cricketers? I guess I know. So let's go with fast bowlers, I guess.
Yeah.
What would be some big rocks, I guess, to manage those fast bowlers?
Yeah. So we have a GPS program like most other elite sports, and we've got our sort of general sort of movement variables that we're looking at in terms of displacements, right? But the other part we do look at is we have some sort of proprietary algorithms that Catapult have put together for us that look at some of the specific elements of force with the fast bowlers, that give us an understanding about sort of player load and the sort of relative intensity. We've got sort of the capacity to understand different velocity signatures at certain time points of the delivery and the run up. So there's certainly some stuff that we're looking at there that help us understand what a player's doing, what they've done, and how they're coping and how they're presenting and what they're putting out, I guess, physically.
And it's probably naive of me, but you got your GPS. Yeah, still ball tracking is going on, and is that specific to the Ks per hour that they bowl? Is it almost like zones of if they're bowling at, let's say they're 150k per hour bowler, do you treat that like max speed for an AFL footballer in terms of percentages of how many balls they bowl at that pace?
Yeah, so we're certainly tracking and monitoring radar gun speed with our bowlers. That's one of the things that we know is an element of their physical output is the velocity. But we're certainly looking at from a sort of GPS and an accelerometer perspective. We're looking at some of the things that they're doing to produce that output. so an analogy will be, rather than just looking at displacement for a vertical jump, right? We'll use a force plate to understand some of the sort of movement signature that's occurring for how they're producing a 65 centimeter vertical jump, for example. So similar with the fast bowlers, we've got 148 kilometers an hour as a mean speed for the match, but we've got some other stuff that sits behind it that might suggest, well, actually, the player was able to maintain their speed across a match or across a series, but actually there's a whole bunch of things that seem to be changing to maintain that output, because humans are pretty clever. They'll self-organize to find the best way to produce the outcome. And at the pointiest end of elite sport, some of those high-end outputs can be maintained. It's just sometimes it comes at a cost.
What about for the batsmen? What are the sort of key areas to manage them?
Yeah, managing their head generally is probably the best way to go. And I'm slightly facetious, but in reality, that's part of it, right? Is making sure that they've sort of got clear air, and that their preparation has been able to be squared away prior to a game. We obviously we're tracking their distances, their speeds, their batting minutes, some of the high speed running loads, etc. They might be getting from either batting and or fielding, and understanding some of the directional change loads that are going on. But certainly the big rocks from a physical perspective when it comes to cricket are certainly your fast bowling group. They're the ones who are exposed to the highest physical load, and batters, you have this sort of underlying landscape of physicality, that with heavy cognitive demand, lots of time on task, those types of things, if they're succeeding, that need to sit above that, right? So you've got to sort of square away some of the sort of underlying landscape, but understand that there's a need to hit a million cricket balls, right? You guys don't get good without doing that. So whilst you might have a sort of a load picture from a movement perspective that is really high, recognizing that it's not just as easy to say, hey mate, I don't think you should bat today, because that's not necessarily going to address the sort of global performance requirements of a batter. I've probably gone off on a bit of a tangent, mate, but it's hopefully that sort of describes the sort of challenges of the different skill groups.
Yeah, 100%. And like you said, it's so individual, and it makes a lot of sense. Like the bowlers, it is quite physical, and then the main stressor for the batsman is the concentration aspect of the role, and you get out and it's pretty the day's over for a batsman. So it makes a lot of sense that the mental side of things is the key pillar. On the different, so 2020 one-day cricket, and then Test cricket, and then obviously all the travelling and everything. Like, do you see future cricketers being specialists? And it's probably already started now, but they are purely going to be a 2020 cricketer, and they're identified early as 2020 is going to be your go, and then Test cricketers with their personality type and their traits and strengths will morph themselves into a test, and then you might have a few that are in between that are one days and can play a bit of all three. Or do you see it being a good batsman will be able to adapt no matter what to all the three different forms of the game?
Yeah, we're certainly seeing more specialists emerge for short format cricket. There's no doubt about that. The opportunities across franchise cricket are presenting a real career path for people to specialise in that area. But the game still prioritises the longest format. I think certainly here in this country, we value and celebrate the longest version of the game. And I think that certainly here in this country, and certainly I think observing the other sort of major test playing nations, players still aspire to play test cricket for their country. So I think that your point about the best batters will find ways. I think that's definitely true. But that being said, the 2020 cricket is changing rapidly. The power game for batters is on another level compared to sort of the early days of the format. Bowling specialists, the impact of spinners, the mystery component of certain spinners. That like this is a rapidly changing format of the game that I think is going to it's going to be really interesting to follow its impact on the ability, what players can actually do out in the cricket field. It's already fascinating, with guys like Glenn Maxwell can play 360 degrees, like this, he's not the only one. There's such a high diversity and array of highly skilled players out there now.
And for the best, like 17 that are contracted to the Australian team, like where would I know it's hard to do percentages and stuff, but like as a physical performance manager, is it majority of your time off season, pre-season preparing for Test cricket, and then the 2020 campaigns and the one day? How's it all fit in?
I mean, in reality, the classic paradigm of pre-season into competitive season just doesn't exist for the majority of the top players. It's far more like tennis, actually, in many respects. I mean, tennis players do get a sort of a shortened pre-season for many of them, but in reality, you're sort of looking at sort of preparation blocks. More so than classic extended pre-season periods. Mm-hmm. So really, what you're actually doing with the top guys is recognizing what the competitive landscape looks like in the short, medium, and long term, and then you're sort of trying to navigate a preparation path that looks to ensure that at the key time points of different format changes, you've sort of got your preparation right. So from fast bowlers, for example. Thankfully, the intensity profile doesn't shift too much, right? But actually, so the thing we need to square away is the skill volume, right? So the number of balls that a player needs to be prepared to bowl, that we need to square that away in preparation for long format cricket, and that's sometimes difficult to do if you've got short format competition leading in. So you've got to find ways to sort of top up, so to speak, and make sure that you're using the sort of training day opportunities where you can to sort of build a sort of more chronic resilience to the higher volumes over time. Similar with the batters, right? You've got to make sure that you're getting some of the higher intensity, ability to change directions hard and fast for short format cricket in periods where you might be playing longer format cricket, where the sort of the higher, more rapid acceleration demands are just not necessarily as dense. So those are things that you sort of need to square away more in your preparation blocks, leading into the sort of competitive periods that are ahead of you.
You have to be super organized, I imagine.
And super adaptable.
Yeah. And going back to your career journey for a second, you've had a lot of leadership positions across different sports. Is that something that you've worked on a lot, leadership, communication, performance meetings, all the things that come with being in a managerial position? Or is it something that you've learned through experience and being, by getting those jobs?
It's both. So, fortunately, when you're sort of in positions of leadership, you get exposed to opportunities to develop more of those skills, and you get opportunities to sort of identify where some of your shortcomings or opportunity, so your performance opportunities might lie. But certainly, and certainly more recently, that's an area that's of great interest to me, is how I can actually be a more effective leader. How can I be a more effective communicator? Making sure that constantly seeking feedback from people on what's working, what's not working. Those are things that are hugely valuable to me.
And so that will be with players. You mentioned coaches in the past. So who would you ask those sort of questions to, that feedback? Who would be your go-tos?
Yeah, so I now routinely ask 3 to 4 people every 2 to 3 months to give me 1 to 3 things that they think I'm doing well, and 1 to 3 things that they think I can do better. And I'll just change the cohort of people that I'll ask, and I'll generally try and ask, of the 3 to 4 people, I'll generally try and ask at least 1 player, at least 1 coach, at least 1 stakeholder from within the state cricket system, and if I can, someone who's close to me that's actually living the day-to-day experience with me, who's not necessarily, a team manager or a physiotherapist or the security manager. I'll ask them to give me an idea about how I'm tracking. And that's something that I've learned over time. I wasn't very good at that early on. Looking back in hindsight, I wasn't very good at going to seek that out. And that's something that over time I've learned is a hugely valuable resource for personal and professional development, is actually the people around you that you're interfacing with every day and the people you're actually trying to impact.
If you're getting, let's say 10 different things, there's a couple that line up, but 10 different things, how do you manage it? How do you filter that to action, those areas?
Yeah, so I've talked about this. One of the things is that trying to identify and prioritize those responses that are generally relatively consistent. You'll always get 10 things, right? And there'll be 10 different things, but in amongst the 10, you'll find that there's 1 to 3 things that generally are a consistent theme. So I'll prioritize those. But they also need to be sort of understood in conjunction with your own sort of personal analysis and insights. It's understanding how do I think I'm going? Where am I being effective? What's not working? Okay, is there some common ground with the responses I'm getting from the people around me? And those are the things that I tend to attack first.
Okay, yeah, I love that. That's great. I'm gonna try and start implementing that. So what's that, once a month?
Yeah, I generally try and do it at least once every 3 months. It's sort of loosely call it the rule of 3, right? Sort of 3 people every 3 months give me 3 things. Mm-hmm. And I actually don't know if I've stolen that from anyone.
Yeah.
But if I have, I apologize for not referencing whoever put it out there. But it's just become a thing for me.
Yeah, it's a good system. I mean, to get 3 things is really succinct, and then, like you said, every 3 months. So, do you think that once you've in an environment for a few years, people are going to come to expect it, or do you vary the person so often that it stays pretty fresh?
No, I think by asking people and being really open about it.
Yeah.
That's done a couple of things. One is it's essentially given permission for people to tell me how I might improve, and it's taken away some of the fear of consequence, because that's one of the things that holds people back from giving you feedback, is they're worried about how you're going to respond. Actually, when you go and seek it out, it actually breaks that down, because people know that you want to hear the information. And part of it is also recognizing that just because someone gives you some feedback doesn't mean you're not beholden to listen to it, right? You're not beholden to change because of a piece of feedback, right? That's part of this, for want of a better term, the contract of seeking feedback. But there's huge value, because people all of a sudden are now, they understand you're looking to get better. And so they're happy to come and, hey, Cal, in your session briefing the other day, I reckon you spoke too much. I reckon you lost the group. Paddy, you know what? I did. I got stuck. I didn't prepare well enough. I got stuck on a detail. It wasn't effective. Thanks for the feedback, mate.
Yeah, that's awesome. And how long, like you mentioned, you're not sure if you got that from someone else, but it sounds like it came organically. How long have you been doing it for?
I've been doing it for a couple of years now, actively. Yeah. And in a far more, in a consistent, routine way. I think, over the course of the last 8 years, I reckon, I've steadily become better at asking people for feedback, but I'm far more routine about trying to open the door for people to give me some insights in how I'm performing.
And as a byproduct, has that created a more inclusive, feedback is, the stigma of the consequences, like you mentioned, is dropped, and now practitioners in your team are asking for feedback and they're more comfortable with feedback, do you think?
I hope so. I mean, I feel like it's increased my ability to get information, and I haven't necessarily had to really go digging as hard as I might have had to 5 years ago.
And what about challenges? What has been like a significant challenge in your career, and what would be the learnings from it? How did you grow?
Yeah, I touched upon one of them earlier, right? It was when I essentially I felt like I'd had a demotion at the Western Bulldogs. That was the first professional sort of challenge that I experienced. So that was and again, I didn't handle it particularly well. But the great thing was that these hardships give you opportunities to reflect. So when I finally had distance and a little bit of maturity to maybe look back and think, how I could have made that situation better. That allowed me the opportunity to recognize, hey, you know what, maybe you can recognize that other people have some real value to add. You don't necessarily have to agree all the time, but there's value in a different way of looking at things. There's also a nice reinforcement for the things that I did stand up for at certain times. So that was certainly one of the sort of first challenges. And I'm open to say, like in 2018, when the team faced a really significant challenge, everything that we've done since has been hugely impactful. Our ability to navigate out of that as a collective and work together to recognize where we can do things a bit differently and a bit better, and to achieve one of the goals, which is sort of regain some of the faith and trust in the public. That's hugely rewarding, and others have spoken far better than I have about that process. But alongside it, the great sort of reinforcement as well is that we've achieved some success on the field at this, along the journey. And I think that, it's a great reinforcement of what a values-led environment can achieve.
And on that note, what's a highlight that you look back fondly of and proud of throughout your career?
For me, like it's always nice to think back to those sort of milestone on-field performances. Recently winning, as a team, seeing the guys win the T20 World Cup last year was hugely rewarding. It was a massive achievement for Australian cricket. That was hugely rewarding in a format that we hadn't sort of we hadn't achieved that before. But again, I hope it doesn't sound cliche, but it's for me the greatest sort of fulfillment comes from thinking about the impact you've had on individuals along the journey. So when I look back at the people that I've sort of worked with or managed and what they're doing in their career, I caught up with a former intern of mine when I was in Hobart for a coffee, and she's got married and she's expecting a baby, and she's a S&C coach at the Tasmanian Institute of Sport, and she's doing great things. Like that's hugely rewarding for me. Seeing players achieve some of their dreams on the field, that's hugely rewarding. And some of the niceties around trophies and recognition, they're icing on the cake, but those are the things that sort of you look back on, I think, and are truly meaningful.
Yeah, like you said earlier, we are to serve. So when you see that the servings are working and you've helped people along their way, that makes a lot of sense. We'll go into the lighter side of the podcast, mate. This is a bit of fun with these questions. So the first one's, which movie or TV series, can be book as well, has impacted you the most, and why?
Oh, I loved Forrest Gump. I loved Forrest Gump when it came out. Just the sort of joy in the simple things of life. I think there's a lot of lessons. Shawshank Redemption, classic. Hero's journey stuff. I love that. Those are sort of, and that's got nothing to do with sort of professional. That's just the sort of, the human side of very much so. I love that. Yeah. I love that stuff. I love it. I love a hero's journey. And I love something that touches on enjoying the simple things in life and the simple joys that can come from, the most innocuous parts of your life.
And what about a favorite inspirational quote or life motto?
The thing I always find about quotes is they're very, very context specific. So I think that, different quotes will resonate at different times in your life. But one of the things that I've probably stuck with me is that, no plan, and apologies for the sort of war reference. I certainly don't want to glorify the sort of military environment at the current time, but certainly the quote, no plan survives first contact with the enemy, I think holds a lot of resonance for me in what we do. We have to plan. I'm a religious planner. I like to be well planned. I like to be well prepared. But it just reminds me that actually it's really important to be adaptable once you hit the trenches, because the reality is that the plan never goes to plan.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Mike Tyson one, which I've forgotten about, but
yeah, that's right. Until you punch in the face, right? That's exactly right.
What about pet peeves? What in your professional life? What makes you angry? What are your pet peeves?
Yeah, I'd probably default when people are disorganized. That probably rubs me up the wrong way. But certainly, I mean, yeah, those are probably the things that sort of get up my goat a little bit when people are disorganized or turn up unprepared for something.
Yep. And then favorite way to spend your day off?
I'm a classic introvert, mate. So on a day off, I generally remove myself from people, and it'll generally involve some form of exercise, preferably in the outdoors. It will involve a lot of coffee. It will, have some sort of mental stimulation of some description, whether it's reading a book or listen to a podcast, and it'll invariably finish with a nice meal of some description.
Yeah, the recharge day. Love that.
yeah, very much.
And in a COVID-free world, favorite holiday destination and why?
My partner Jenna and I went to Croatia in 2016, which feels like decades ago right now after COVID and 3 kids under 5. But yeah, that part of the Dalmatian coast and Croatia, and that was certainly, that was a really fun time, really awesome experience.
Well, we're at the end of the podcast, mate. Thank you so much for jumping on and sharing your experiences and helping us developing strength and conditioning coaches learn off yourself, as well as the athletes as well, to pick up some gems to help their game. What are you excited about for 2022, mate? What's on the horizon for you?
I've learned that most of my unhappiness comes from unmet expectations. So I'm trying not to have too many. But certainly I spoke to you off air that I've got some time off the road. I've taken some time away from touring to sort of recharge and spend some time with family, which has been really important. And to be able to do that in an environment that's, starting to open up and is a bit more like our sort of normal life, that I'm really looking forward to that. I'm enjoying that right now, being able to, live our lives, as close to normal as is possible in the current times with the family. That's something I'm really looking forward to in the short term. And then we're scheduled to go to Sri Lanka in the middle of the year, and we haven't been there for a better part of, will be 6 years pretty much by that stage. So I'm really excited that we can get back to Sri Lanka. It's a great place to tour, and they're amazing people, and be really exciting. I think by that stage I'll be jumping out of my skin to get back on the road and get back to doing what we do.
And for those that want to get in contact with you, where's the best place?
Yeah, I mean, you can. I'll probably spend more time on a personal level on Instagram, but certainly, I'm trying to spend more time and do more sharing of my learning and insights on LinkedIn. So reach out to me on LinkedIn from a professional perspective. That's probably the best place to catch me, and also hopefully, somewhere I can add some value to my network.
Absolutely, we'll add the links in the show notes. Well, thanks again, Aaron. And thank you for jumping on the podcast, and thank you for everyone listening in live. If you joined on a little bit later on, you can watch the recording on our YouTube channel, and then in the next couple of weeks we'll post the podcast recording, which you can watch on any of your directories, the Spotify, iTunes, and we'll upload that on Instagram when it releases. But thanks again, Aaron, for jumping on. Our next live chat will be with Daryl Griffiths, the founder of Code of Nutrition, and that'll be next Thursday at 8:30 p.m. I'll see you